I'll go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is India Futterman. I am the Science Education Specialist at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. So I wear a number of different hats. One of them, which is one of my favorite hats, is being the adult leader of our chapter of Teen Science Café. And Teen Science Café is a national network of educational institutions, libraries, museums, nature preserves like the Albany Pine Bush that assist teens, local teens, in planning and hosting social events on a monthly basis featuring a local STEM professional, a researcher, somebody in the industry, who's here to share with you their work, their research, and their career path that got them to where they are today. And I'll leave the introductions of our special guest for Ani, a team leader. But I do just want to say that I will be reading off your answers from the chat. If Raquel poses a question to the group, which she will, we're going to have some discussion components. So I'll sort of be there as a translator, as will Ani, and Shreya might be in the chat typing responses to you. So if you see someone named Shreya who's answering questions or responding to you, then you know who it is. Shreya Devaram is a wonderful team leader. So without further ado, I'd like to pass this on to Ani Gregory Asadurian, who is a team leader and has been for the past year. Thank you so much, Ani.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Teen Science Café. I am Ani Gregory Asadurian, one of the team leaders who helps organize these events, and I'm a junior at Shaker High School. Thank you all for coming to our first cafe of the season with our special guest, Dr. Raquel Velho. Dr. Velho is an assistant professor and undergraduate program director in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at RPI. She has conducted extensive research concentrating in disability studies with a focus on accessibility and public transit. She received her PhD of Science and Technology Studies from the University College of London, her MSc in Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society from the Imperial College of London, and her BA in Sociology from the Université des Nantes of France. Today, Dr. Velho is going to share with us her unique interdisciplinary approach to research regarding infrastructure exclusion and inclusion processes. We encourage you to place any questions and comments you have into the Q&A section of the chat. Inappropriate or off-topic comments will not be permitted. We would also like to let everyone know that this event will be recorded. Thank you all very much, and now please enjoy Dr. Raquel Velho's fascinating presentation.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for that really, really wonderful introduction. And thank you so much to Teen Science Café for hosting me and having me speak on some of my trajectory as well as on my research. And really, that's what I'm hoping to kind of get across today is not just telling you about all of the research that I do, which of course I will, but also kind of telling you a little bit about how I got to where I got. So I didn't really know how to title this presentation, and I actually asked the team leaders to help me out with this title. And thank you to Lily for suggesting some of the sentences that we could have played with. And I think everybody agreed that the things we don't see kind of really captures the spirit of my presentation today. So let's start with this. I want to start with a very personal little story, okay? How did this turn into this intense emo phase that I'm exceedingly proud of, turn into this? Somebody with 3 degrees that is actually not of this land at all and is speaking to you in your language relatively fluently with a few accents from time to time, as you might remark. I'm the result of what people call third culture kids. We're people who were born in one place and then moved around a lot throughout our lifetime and kind of have this weird mix of the intersection of who our friends are, who our family is, and where we have traveled. And that's kind of the result of our personal identity and culture. We're a really weird kind of crew. Some of you may know some, as we call them, military brats, the ones that have kind of moved around a lot because either their parents are in the military, one of their parents is in the military, and then they just moved around every time that the parent has had a new designation. But, and I'll tell you this in a little second, for me, it wasn't the result of being a military brat. For me, it was the result of being an academic brat. So this is what my life has looked like. I was born in Brazil in 1990, and then you can see all of this list of moves kind of averaging every 3 to 4 years. I ended up in a new place. You'll see that Brazil kind of functioned as my family's home base. We ended up going back to Brazil a few times, often between the United States and Brazil. And then from the 2000s on, I really kind of started living in Europe, where I lived in the Netherlands for 4 years and then returned to Brazil, and then claimed my full independence at the ripe age of 16 to move to France, and stayed in France for about the rest of my high school education, as well as my undergraduate education. And then moved for 1 semester to Italy for a study abroad program, as though I hadn't been studying abroad often enough in my life. And then moved to the UK for my master's and my PhD. After that is when I got this job over here at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which I now call my home, and bought a house here in Albany. I live just off Delaware Avenue, so if you're ever around here, drop me an email and let's go meet. Let's go grab some coffee or tea. And I don't know, I really like it here. This has been a really good place for me so far. So I called myself an academic brat. Both of my parents, and this is my wonderful parents, are and were academics. My mom is a college professor and has had visiting positions in all of those places that I mentioned, in the United States, in the Netherlands. And my father and I always kind of went with her because my father is a researcher as well and kind of assisted her a lot. So I had this privilege of being able to travel and learn a whole bunch of different languages and be exposed to diverse cultures. But my dad was also really into music and was a cellist himself. So I was encouraged, but really forced to learn how to play the cello, which brought with it a lot of discipline, and just really being applied in learning a new craft and practicing that craft in public, which is why I'm actually quite comfortable speaking to however many of you there are. I can't see the numbers anymore. And I never usually get a lot of anxiety around public speaking because I've been performing with orchestras throughout my life. Another thing you should know about me is that if you haven't noticed already, I'm a huge nerd. I am obsessed with video games, obsessed with sci-fi, obsessed with fantasy. And all of these little bits of information I'm giving you because our histories really, really profoundly shape us. It's on the base of all of these things that my parents really gave me and that I was privileged to have as I was growing up and to learn as I was growing up, that I started stepping into academia. Now, Ani mentioned that I got my bachelor's degree in sociology at the University of Nantes, and this is really where everything began for me because I took my undergraduate degree really seriously as an opportunity to explore the worlds that I was so obsessed with, and particularly video games. So I started studying this world of video games and culture, trying to understand the way I saw it when I was 19, 20, that, it seems like a lot of my girlfriends don't love video games. They like video games, but they're not obsessed with it. Meanwhile, I had all of these guy friends that were playing World of Warcraft obsessively. Remember, this is the mid 2000s. I get it. World of Warcraft is perhaps not really a big thing anymore. Perhaps the equivalent would be, I don't know, Borderlands or something like that, or Fortnite. But I didn't understand why this gendered division seemed to be happening. So I dedicated 2 of my coursework essays to kind of studying this. And it was based off of all of this work on video games and video game culture that my mom said to me, Raquel, why don't you join me to this trip to Buenos Aires in Argentina? And it's a conference on technology and social inclusion, topics that it seems like you're really, really interested in. And also it's in Buenos Aires, you've never been there before, and you're gonna have the chance to see a whole new city. Well, listeners, I did not really see the new city at all. I spent almost every single hour of every day of the conference at the conference itself. It was so fascinating being exposed to all of these different people discussing technology and how technology shapes our worlds and how technology shapes our societies, and also how the other way around also applies, right? Technologies look the way they do because of us. Humans create technology. So what is it about us as humans and what is it about technology that, when put together, are so fascinating? And it just kept going. After I was exposed to that conference, I started really growing into academia. I got my master's degree in science, technology, medicine, and society. And I actually went to visit the site where I got accepted for my PhD, like a whole 2 or 3 years before I even started doing my PhD. I met my advisors, Brian Balmer and Catherine Holloway, who are my advisors for both my master's and my PhD. And they were like, Raquel, we get it. You're obsessed with technology. You're obsessed with specifically prosthetics at the time, you know, like prosthetic limbs, like robot arms and things like that. And they were like, that's really neat. And we think that's really interesting. But we think prosthetics are range to much bigger perspectives than what you're talking about. We think wheelchairs are also a type of prosthetic that you haven't considered before. And Catherine is doing this really interesting work on wheelchair user accessibility. And I was like, tell me more. Tell me more about wheelchair user accessibility. Like in my head, all that meant was, okay, so you study ramps. What else is there to study? Like either there's a ramp or there isn't a ramp, and that's what accessibility is about, right? Well, it kept going. Obviously, there was a lot more to be said about accessibility than ramps. I got an unconditional offer to do my PhD there, and I did it because now I have my PhD in Science and Technology Studies from the University College London. The person you see pictured with me is my best friend in the whole wide world, Ermin Sözüdoğru. He's actually a philosopher of medicine. So if you're interested in that, I have a really good contact for you. He's now a professor at the University College London, where we got our PhDs, and works on a lot of really cool stuff, including uncertainty in vaccinations. So a really hot topic right now. Based off that work is what I got my current job off of. I came to do my interview at Rensselaer Polytechnic in January 2017 when I was finishing my writing up process on my PhD. So I was about 5 months out from defending my actual dissertation, which was really, really scary. And they invited me to do a campus visit here at RPI. So I came in January 2017 and was interviewed by basically the whole department. And one of the things that I had to do was teach an undergraduate class on the work that I do. And it clearly went really well because there I am. That's the first picture of me in my brand new corner office that I really, really love and has the best light. Although you can't really tell from that picture. But okay, that doesn't really tell you very much about my work. So before I get too deep into that, I want to tell you a little bit about one of our tools in sociology. One of the things we do a lot as sociologists is observe the world. I know that sounds really like bland, but it really is what it is. It's a lot of time just sat on a bench in a corner of a room that you're interested in and taking a lot of notes on what is going on in that room. So I want to turn that on you. Let's practice observation for a little bit. Now, it's going to get a little awkward because it's going to go quiet. There's no audio to this video whatsoever. And let's just be okay with it being quiet. And use the chat function here on Zoom and just kind of write down the things that you're observing that are happening in this video, okay? Here we go. I'm just gonna let this roll for like a minute or so. You all just take a time and start throwing some things in the chat. And I'm gonna have Ani and India kind of read them to me because I can't actually have it open, the chat open at the same time as we do this. Let's just repeat that video a little bit more. Oh, I can actually open chat. Okay, so Lindley says, it does not appear easy for the wheelchair users to use the ramp and get on the bus. Did anybody have anything else? Maybe Ani and India can tell me what they think too.
Yeah, so in the video, we can all observe that there are some struggles, even with the supposed accessibility things that have been added to the bus. There are still issues for people trying to use a wheelchair to get onto the bus.
Perfect. The ramp seems like it's too steep. The driver of the bus, okay, so Patrick says the driver of the bus should help push them up. Now that's a really interesting comment that I'll address in a little bit. But for now, let's just say things that are happening and not things that should be happening. And this is a really, really key distinction in sociology as well, is that in the moments of observation, we have to do our best to hold those totally fair judgments, right? Because we're trying to see what is going on in the picture. So besides the fact that there are struggling, did anybody remark anything else?
So to me, this person who we just watched is smiling, even while appearing to struggle, which I think there could be a lot of interpretations to that. Maybe trying to add levity, maybe like smiling out of discomfort, but it's interesting that you can see their expressions, their facial expressions, especially that person. So, and Akash says the railings are helping them get up. So sort of this hoisting, right? So.
Absolutely, playing a really big role in helping them get up. And what Leanne has pointed out too, it seems like this ramp is too steep, right? So here's what I'm going to do. Let's add one layer of context here, which is something that you can't possibly have known without me telling you, although you may have inferred if you observed really, really closely what was going on. So I'm adding context. Know that this is part of an engineering study. Now, when you know that this is the part of an engineering study, what else do you start noticing? Same thing. It's okay for things to go quiet for a little bit. Just watch and think about the situation. What else do you notice?
I think that in the video, you can see that like what the comments in the chat were saying about the railings and the ramp steepness, how people, the people who are trying to get onto the bus have still figured out ways to get on, even with the obstacles. But you can see like with momentum and other things, how in an engineering study, they'd be trying to figure out the way to make this go the smoothest.
Absolutely. Does anybody have any guesses as to what they're measuring? As to what the engineers are measuring?
Would it, well, one of the measurements would probably be the incline, right, of the ramp. And what I'm noticing, there's even like mental calculations on the part of the users who are thinking, you know, how far, they're reassessing how far back do I need to go in order to propel myself up the ramp. You know, so yeah.
So one thing that nobody has noticed quite yet is all of these little orange points on their arms and on their back, which you can probably see most clearly in this case. And let me introduce her by name. This is a pseudonym. Her name is Rita, and you can tell right here on the back of her neck that there's a little orange square. And if you look a little bit earlier, you can see it around her wrist and around her arm as well, right? Now, this is what was going on. The problem that was being investigated is the problem in the way that it was formulated by the engineers. The ramps, as they understand it, are a problem for wheelchair users when they board the bus. So one of the things that they're testing, and in this case, not measuring, is the gradient of the ramp. And the reason why they're measuring the gradient of the ramp is because accessibility regulations in the United Kingdom tell us that ramps have to be at a maximum a 12% gradient of inclination. That's the absolute max. So what they were trying to test is, what does this maximum ramp inclination do to wheelchair users? So they were measuring actually the amount of force, the amount of body force that wheelchair users need to place onto the wheels of their wheelchair in order to board the bus. And the big result that came out of this is that 12% is already too much and can actually cause irreparable harm to wheelchair users' joints, especially when they're dependent on buses as a mode of transportation in their day-to-day lives. But as India actually pointed out, well, this seems like they're laughing, right? There seems to be like a kind of a comfort in what was going on. And there was. And this is where I come in, because the engineers were doing all of these tests in a very controlled environment. And this is something that you probably couldn't tell except for the hints of the bus being empty. Basically, this is a controlled environment. There was nobody on the bus at all. It was just the engineers and the wheelchair user that was trying to board. The bus was completely stationary, and there was no pressure on the wheelchair user to basically instantly board the bus and get on and let's go with the bus, right? So what I did in this work was I actually interviewed wheelchair users about their experiences with the experience itself, with the experiment. And I wanted to know about their perspective on accessibility and what they perceived to be the problems of accessibility. And of course, if you sit down and tell them like, well, at 12% incline, you're already putting too much push force and your joints are really going to hurt, they're going to care about that. But that's not what they were telling me in interviews. They weren't telling me about how painful it was. Rather, they had these really little interesting things to say. So in Rita's case, she was telling me how 75% of the time, she doesn't even bother using the ramp because she knows that it's going to be a faff, that it's going to break. She actually has developed this technique of bunny hopping off the bus and back onto the street or to the sidewalk, and from the sidewalk onto the bus. Granted, she's a very capable wheelchair user. She's actually a Paralympian. So, you know, really, really healthy, in really good shape by every human standard imaginable. Marta, on the other hand, telling me about her experience was like, are you kidding me? That experience was a cakewalk. In comparison to the real deal, this was much easier. So she said, in a real experience, you're dealing with real people and obviously the driver. Compared to the real experience, that was much easier. So let me show you, it's not a perfect example of the real deal, but this was a news item that came out on, I believe, on Channel 4 News in the United Kingdom. And it tells you the story of Kardashian, who's trying to board a bus. So this one does have audio, and please let me know if you can't hear it.
A few minutes later, Kurdistan tried to board a bus with an empty double buggy on board. The bus driver moved it, but then this happened.
You just told me. What I'm saying to you is unreasonable. No, suppose the lady came downstairs and put her two kids in the buggy. What would you do? Yeah, but you still couldn't get on the bus though, couldn't you? Do you know what bus stop she's going? No, we don't know what bus stop she's going. Everybody stay there on the wheelchair buggy, and you. But she's a priority as well. She's got two kids. Driver said it's two bag inside. And then I said to him, well, it's an empty buggy, no child. So he said, wait, he went upstairs. He said, oh, the buggy owner is upstairs. And I can't come on the bus, we're waiting on you. Come on the bus, just come on the bus. You're holding up the bus for everybody. Can you come on the bus?
Get to work, hurry up.
That's what I'm saying, get on the bus then.
Campaigners may have won in court today, but this shows it could be very difficult to enforce. Olivia Kinsley, 5 News.
Okay, I don't expect everybody to be fluent in British English, especially the type of accents that you heard, some of which were quite working class, some of which were foreign accents in British English. So let me contextualize and put up a transcript for you, okay? Having observed what you just observed, same kind of deal. Take a second. What else can you tell me about wheelchair users boarding buses and accessibility, given the observations that you've done in both of those contexts? Just gonna go quiet again for a minute or so. Take your time to put things in the chat. And same with Ani and India, you're in the hot seat too.
Ani, do you want to read that? Oh, sorry, Raquel.
Ani, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So Leanne said that in real life situations, the wheelchair users might be harassed by other passengers.
Absolutely. So what do we think might be some of the access issues that are going on? What else can you tell me in general about wheelchair users boarding buses?
I think we can see that there is an issue with, like Leanne was saying, the other people not being considerate of the different time that it takes different people to be able to board the bus, because it's obviously made for people without wheelchairs to be able to board it easier, and people aren't being considerate.
Totally. India, how about you? Anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's also a matter of space and having the right amount of space and the right amount of sort of, I don't want to say wiggle room, but, you know, a more official term than that, because it's true that, you know, prams are strollers they take up a lot of space, and, you know, there needs to be enough space for both of these things. And it was weird, this sort of weighing of who's more important, you know, the mom with her buggy or the wheelchair user. And that's an irrelevant argument, I would think, but it still is happening, and it's an impossible decision to make. So
yeah, it's a really, really hot priority debate actually in the UK, to the point that it went to the Superior Court back in 2015, and it didn't wrap up until 2017. So I was writing about this in a really, really hot moment of the topic about who has the priority, right? You have all of these posters throughout London and bus stops that have the, and they say buggies, and they say what they mean by buggies is strollers. So they say buggy users, please make way for wheelchair users. And there are these big white posters with red writing, and they recently reversed it to red posters with white writing. So they're really trying to emphasize this message. And as Lily points out in the chat, it appears to be very difficult and stressful for wheelchair users to board buses. It undoubtedly is. And this is exactly what I ended up concluding. And I'm going to get into how I got into this conclusion in a second and tell you a little bit more about this history. So the problem of accessibility in London is multiple. It's not just a question of the ramp inclination. It's not even just a question of whether or not there is a ramp there. It's a question of the space on the bus, of driver and wheelchair users' communication. Sometimes the ramps are too sensitive. They're actually deployed mechanically by the touch of a button, but they have these sensors underneath them. And if they bump against anything, whether that's the curb, whether that's street furniture like trash cans, they're super sensitive and they go back into the bus and they don't want to deploy again. People sometimes don't move and don't make way. Wheelchair users feel like they're constantly being observed and being judged on whether or not they're disabled enough to use a wheelchair. And it keeps going on and on and on. So this is just buses. okay? My research was about public transportation writ large in London. So that includes the underground, that includes the tube, the metro. So these difficulties get even worse when you consider all forms of transportation infrastructure in the United Kingdom. This is how basically I got to the very, very simple research question that I used to direct all of my research on this topic. I just wanted to know, how do wheelchair users use public transport? That's it. And the reason why I asked this question is it felt like I couldn't go a single week or month without having a news story like the one you just watched about Kurdistan, either in print form or in video form, about wheelchair users struggling with transportation. And yet wheelchair users are still using public transportation. So how does that happen? I'm going to guide you through to this conclusion, but basically I came up with this two-part response. Wheelchair users use public transport, one, with difficulty, clearly, but also they do it by developing really good strategies for inclusion. Now, bear with me on this because I'm going to talk for a little while and you're going to see some good images. But if at any moment, and this goes especially for India and Ani, I start going too fast, you stop me or drop a message in the chat and I'll repeat things, okay? So, history of transportation in London. We're going back. We're going back to Victorian era. Started off in the 1800s with the omnibuses. These were horse-drawn carriages serving the main roads in London, but even then, congestion, traffic, gridlock was horrible. There were so many images of the 1800s of just like butt-to-butt horse carriages, basically getting nowhere already in central London. So kind of in response to that, the first tube was proposed. And historians, and I wish I could just grab the book, maybe I can, it's right over here somewhere. I thought it was. This one. So right in this book, one of the things that they tell us about in the process of developing the first tube is that Victorians were moles. So we shouldn't really be surprised at the fact that they decided to start digging tunnels and put trains in those tunnels because they love tunnels and they love trains. So put them both together and it's like a dream come true. So the first tube was inaugurated in 1863, the very, very, very first train, underground metro in the world. It's the Metropolitan line. And from there, we basically got an explosion of lines. There were like 11 lines built by 1915, 1916. So really it experienced this really huge boom. Now, I'm not going to go into super long detail into the rest of this history, but suffice it to say that the map of the London Underground and really most of the infrastructure in London has kind of remained the same from the 1960s onwards. It hasn't really shifted all that much, and most of the changes that have happened are really around regulations, especially because of the 1987 fire in King's Cross. And there were a lot of administrative changes, which is one of the things that I learned a lot about in this book, which is about specifically the relationship between transportation and politicians, and just how much politicians promise us about transportation infrastructure. So one of the things that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was basically a hot potato of who was going to be taking care of London transportation. So I'm not going to bore you with that because even I found it deathly boring. But one of the things that was really, really great about all of this was realizing that nobody was talking about accessibility. Really, the first time that we start seeing things around accessibility is around the early 1990s. We see the Disability Discrimination Act of the United Kingdom, which is kind of like the Americans with Disability Act here in the United States, where we start really legislating for better access. And that led to a whole bunch of changes, which I'm going to get into in a second. But keep this in mind then. This transportation system has kind of looked the same, roughly, for about 60 to 70 years. And it was built in the Victorian times. So let's just keep that in mind. Now, let's think about the history of disability, okay? Now, again, this is taking us way back. I'm not going to take a whole bunch of your time to describe how the Elizabethans felt or the Tudors felt about disability, but you can probably kind of guess. There was a lot of discrimination around disabled people, but particularly there was this law that made a distinction between what was called the deserving and the undeserving poor. Now, the idea was basically that people who could work but didn't are the undeserving poor. Like, what are you doing? You can totally work. We're not going to give you anything. And the deserving poor are disabled people. They're the elderly, or children, or they are people who are not physically or mentally capable of doing work. So this category kind of became a category of like, oh, you are people who need charity to live. You need communal help to live. Now, around the Victorian times, this was kind of already a given. There have been multiple iterations on the same theme of the Elizabethan Poor Law since 1601 to the 1850s. We've seen a lot of this distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor, and usually along the lines of who's capable of working and who isn't capable of working. And then industrialization, that period where we saw a lot of industries really be born, especially around coal, steam-powered machinery, starting to build these really big like textile machines. If you've learned in history about the Luddites that were like breaking machines because they were losing their jobs in terms of going from artisanal workplaces to really, really big industry and factories, this is that moment, right? This is the industrial era. And what we started seeing is this distancing between the artisanal work that happens in the home versus the work that happens in factories. So you have to go from your home to your place of work. This is when the concept of commuting was first developed. The fact that you leave your home and go elsewhere for work. I know things have started changing a little bit again, but that's when things started, that distinction started happening. And this is a really key moment if you really think about it, because, okay, so we have people who cannot work, the deserving poor, the disabled people, and also we have this separation of home and work life. And it's transportation that's supposed to be this bridge between your home and your work life. You commute to work in public transportation. But public transportation was being developed at a moment when it was just assumed, well, disabled people don't work, so disabled people won't commute. So we don't have to develop public transportation that centers the needs of disabled people because they're not going to use it. They're not the target demographic. They're not the target users of public transportation, right? So that has resulted in what I've been calling infrastructural segregation. Other people call this design apartheid, or very simply, basically it's created this exclusion of disabled people from public transportation infrastructure. Because as soon as you intersect the history of disability with the history of transportation, you see that the moment when transportation was really consolidated in the UK from the 1860s to the 1960s, the assumption was simply disabled people aren't going to use that. I'm not saying somebody stood up and said, we're going to purposefully exclude disabled people from using the system. That's not what was being said. It was just that they didn't really have to be considered. Socially speaking, people didn't think this was of any concern. So, well, we're just not going to design things that cater to that. What that has resulted in, though, is kind of a stabilization around that. Like, it's become really difficult to change the system because infrastructures take a lot of money, a lot of willpower, and a lot of actual manual labor to change them significantly. So what we started seeing was the birth of the disability rights movement around the questions of transportation. So what you see in this really wonderful picture is in the 1990s, I mentioned the Disability Discrimination Act. Disabled people started taking to the streets. They started really becoming activists for accessibility and for access services, and particularly to transportation. So you can perhaps see right in the middle of the image, the letters DAN, DAN. That's the Disability Action Network. And they ran in the early 1990s a whole bunch of campaigns around accessible transportation. Actually, it was called CAT, C-A-T, the Campaign for Accessible Transport, where they had these beautiful posters that say, to boldly go where all others have gone before, kind of a play on that Star Trek title. And really, this is exactly what they're about. And this is one of the things that created the impetus for better accessibility. Now, despite all of the successes that they have acquired, such as the provision of ramps and low floor buses, and also making some tube stations, actually 89 out of 270 tube stations are step-free access, that is, has some kind of accessibility provision, it's still really difficult. All of these ideas that we've inherited, all of this history around transportation has kind of cemented and sedimented in such a way that it's really difficult for us to completely change it overnight. And infrastructures are big, kind of ugly things that nobody really wants to talk about, everybody wants to ignore, nobody wants to maintain. So it becomes really difficult for true changes to happen. So we interviewed a whole bunch of wheelchair users to tell me about how they deal with this kind of like a paradox, right? It feels like an interesting thing of like, well, you're telling me that there were positive changes, but also that they're really struggling. So which one is it? Well, it's both. So this is how Amy put it when we were talking. She said, you just have to think differently about how you do things. So I've actually got a tube map where I've just taken a black felt pen and crossed out all the stations that I can't use. Because even if you've got the logos on the tube map, and she means the little wheelchair symbol, it's just easier if you see ones that you can use. So she literally just took the map and was like, yeah, I know that the symbols are there to help me, but they don't help me all that much because I still might assume that I can use a station. So I just crossed out all of the ones that I cannot use. And so I can only see the ones that I absolutely know that I can. Or somebody like Alan, who is one of the best humans in the whole world. And I'm actually going to have a catch-up conversation with him next week, which is super exciting. But he told me this. They're in charge. By they, he means specifically the employees of a station. They're in charge, but you're in control. It's their station. They know the rules. They're the ones that can say yes or no, but they can't make you do anything you don't want to do. Now, Alan is a person who's really interesting because he actually carries a portable ramp on the back of his chair. And he often travels with his wife, Yvonne. And Yvonne is the one that deploys this ramp for him. What that means is that they've actually created their kind of own accessible network that a lot of other wheelchair users can't use if they don't carry a ramp on the back of their wheelchair, but they're creating access everywhere they go. They find new ways of intervening in the system that has excluded them for centuries, and they're just creating access as they go along. And one of the things that has occurred as a result of this is other wheelchair users have seen this as a strategy and as a tactic, and they've started doing the same. And the other thing is, he started showing to employees how you can actually, at some stations, use these ramps to go from a platform that is higher than a train. Usually the platform is lower than a train. So you're trying to go up the ramp onto the train. It's rare that it's the other way around. And Transport for London, the administrative body, started realizing that Alan was using his ramp to do the other way around. And they decided to develop a whole new ramp that would do that as well. So all of this creativity is generating more access because people are realizing how much knowledge wheelchair users have about the system that maybe should get incorporated into the system. And that's what they're doing. This is exactly where somebody like Kirsten comes in. This is what she told me. So I think people should be aware that they're changing the network, the world, just by being there. You don't change anything if you stay at home. And this is true for about 95% of the wheelchair users that I interviewed, at the very end of the interviews, I would wrap up with 3 quick fire questions they would have to answer in like really short answers. And I would just be like, okay, so tell me what advice you would give to a wheelchair user that's just starting to use public transportation here. Almost every single one of them was like, you have to do it. Don't not do it. My number one advice is to do it. Plan your routes, make sure that you know like safe routes, that you know where your exits are, that you're keeping watchful eye, that you're vigilant in the process. But go out there and use it. People need to know that we use this transportation system. They need to stop erasing us and thinking that we're not there. Well, that's basically the result of all of this. They're breaking the cycle. This is what wheelchair users have been doing for the past 20 plus years. And honestly, 30, 40 plus years in transportation in London. They're breaking the cycle where disabled people are seen as passive, as though they don't need transportation, which has created this idea for, especially for politicians that are going like, well, how many wheelchair users really use public transit? How much access do we really need to provide? And wheelchair users are saying, we use it, provide it, we will come. So that whole idea is what guides the impetus for interviewees to tell other wheelchair users to just go for it. Plan it, but leave your home and do it, because you're helping us break a cycle of invisibility. And that's one of the really, really important ideas here, is breaking the cycle of invisibility. Am I really disabled because of who I am, or am I disabled because of the infrastructures and because of the barriers that you've built around me? This is one of the questions that disabled people and wheelchair users have been asking, is I'm not disabled because of who I am. I'm disabled because of what's been created around me. So help me break these barriers. So let's go back to that question. Like any good sociologist, I give you the answer at the beginning and the end again. But the end version of it is a little bit more complicated because I've explained everything every step of the way, or I hope I have. So let's take some questions too. So how do wheelchair users use public transit? Well, one, they use it with difficulty. You've seen it yourselves, right? That's the result of this history of what I call the infrastructural consolidation, the moment in which infrastructure has stabilized during a moment of social segregation of disabled people as a result of the Elizabethan Poor Laws, as a result of Victorian industrialization. That said, wheelchair users use public transport also by developing these really good strategies for inclusion, for making themselves visible. And in that way, wheelchair users are actively reshaping the infrastructure in London, the public transportation infrastructure in London, every single day. And this connects with a lot of different stories, including mine and including yours. Histories shape our world very literally, very literally. This is how public transportation ended up the way it did, is through this inherited history. And the histories of exclusion are felt to this very day. But that doesn't mean that it has to end there. Histories don't ever have a clear end. We're still living it. So the fight for inclusion is slow, but it has collected really, really huge victories, and they're continuing to acquire big victories. And that's one of the reasons actually Alan wants to talk to me again. I mentioned that I'm going to start my book that I'm currently writing on this. I mentioned to him that I started by describing the trip that I took with him and his wife. And he was like, well, if you're starting with this story, why don't you add a little epilogue? Let's have a conversation. And I can tell you all of the things that have changed since that day in September 2015, and you can update your story. And I was like, that sounds wonderful. So we're going to do that. So how has your history shaped you? And how are you going to shape the world around you? Because I think those two tensions are things that we often take for granted and are invisible to us. But it's one of the things that I really want to make visible to you, is that your history shapes you. Our histories shape our world, but we get a chance at shaping them as well. So let's use that wisely and let's use that responsibly. So thank you. And let's take a time to have a little bit of a chat too.
Raquel, before we get into a discussion, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to deliver such a wonderful presentation. And everything worked beautifully, the videos and the audio. And it's just, I just want to acknowledge that up front. That makes me so happy. And my thoughts are racing in the best possible way. And you caused me to think a lot about how I use the infrastructures in my day-to-day life. So I just wanted to thank you and acknowledge that. And I would like to open it up in the last 9 minutes that we have together at this webinar. I'd love to open it up for questions or even just thoughts and comments. We can think about Raquel's final 2 questions that she's left us with, which are, how has your history shaped you? And how are you going to both use the way that history has shaped you to continue to shape the world around you? And how do you do it on a day-to-day basis? So take a minute to mull over that. And definitely put your comments and thoughts in the chat, please, and we can read them out. I'd love to have a discussion.
Thank you, India. That's very kind.
Well, I just wanted to say that was a phenomenal presentation. And I actually had a story of my own where, so my grandmother had MS and she was in a wheelchair. And one time we went to this cafe and it was like, we had to take a ferry from where she lived. It was a little far away. And we realized that we forgot her portable wheelchair, her portable wheelchair that we usually take in the car. And what we did was we got a chair from inside the restaurant and we had the waiters offered to carry her in on the chair. So they took the chair and they carried her in, basically made their own wheelchair. So I think this is really interesting, like what you're saying with Alan, when there's a will, there's a way. And yeah.
I love that. And I've collected so many stories of wheelchair users telling me similar things. So in one case, Anton was telling me about how he got trapped on a train and there was just no way out. There was no employee waiting for him with the ramp that he needed to disembark. And there was a group of, in his words, drunk football supporters. And by football, obviously he means soccer because this is the UK. So there was a group of drunk football supporters that literally lifted him in his chair and placed him out. And were 2 of them were holding the door so that the doors wouldn't close on them. And these stories are really funny on the face of them when they're being told afterwards. But when you stop and think about that experience, how scary that must be and how upsetting it must be to be forgotten, be left behind. And thankfully, there are always kind people. Mr. Rogers says, right, look for the helpers. So the helpers were there and he was really lucky that they were, because he might have got stuck at midnight on a train, and that sounds really horrible.
That makes me think though about how there's also this weird tension of what if you receive help that you didn't ask for and don't need? And this isn't an example about that in particular, but I had a friend who was a wheelchair user who they would constantly get pats on their shoulder from people just because that happened to be where their shoulder was at. And it was just this, I don't even know what prompted it, pity or, just not thinking, but something something that I've been thinking about is I guess how wheelchairs invite or don't invite non-wheelchair users to sort of interact with the wheelchair itself and what it needs to have personal space and be in this, be using this device, and which kind of goes back to this idea of wheelchair as a prosthetic, that it's an extension of your body. And then how do you sort of demand that people respect that as part of your body? And again, I'm speaking as a non-wheelchair user, so I'm not sure how wheelchair users themselves conceive of it, but maybe if you had thoughts on that, Raquel. I saw you pulled out a tome. I'm excited. So.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying. I thought I had it printed out, but I don't. So I'm trying to kind of speak and at the same time try to open this up. I have for those who don't know, it was mentioned that I'm the undergraduate program director at Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer. But I actually, one of the topics that I most teach on is design and design work. And I teach a lot on design and disability. There's a beautiful book that I really recommend and has been written for undergraduate audiences, but I think for high school students, it's also absolutely perfect. And I'm color matching with it. This is Sarah Hendren's book, What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World. And it's one of the most beautiful books on design, disability, why is the world the way it is, who was the world built for? And I really recommend it. But one of the things that I was actually trying to pull up, and I hope I do as I keep prolonging this comment, is this image from a special issue on a journal called Catalyst, which is an issue on what's called crip technoscience. There's like a process of reclaiming the term cripple by disability communities only. And I want to make that very clear that it's disabled people calling themselves cripple and not anybody else. But there's a beautiful cover image for it that's trying to address this idea of forced intimacy, which is this idea that disabled people aren't really autonomous or feel like they aren't, or that they're children in some way, and that their boundaries are constantly broken because people assume that, well, you can just touch their wheelchair or push their wheelchair without asking for consent. And that's a very, very serious issue. I think I managed to get it. So it's not going to be perfect, and I apologize for that. But hopefully you can see this screen. So you can see that this is somebody who has installed spikes on the handle of their wheelchair because they grew so sick of people pushing them or touching their wheelchair without consent that they just said, you know what, I'm taking it into my own hands, putting spikes on the places that people are not supposed to touch. So it's like a nice little design intervention, hostile architecture, hostile design in a very interesting way. So I thought I'd share that image as well.
Perfect. That's amazing. I thought it looked almost like it's like also like a conceptual art piece as well. There's many layers to that. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's like, this is a discussion that could go on for hours, days. It can go on for a whole career. So
that's what I'm here for.
Exactly. And I do believe that we will be cut off at 7, and I would hate for us to be cut off mid-sentence. And so I will stop us here and again express my gratitude and inspiration that I've felt from hearing all this. And Ani, a big thank you to you too for being the face of the teen leaders tonight. We've got 15 teen leaders, and Ani has done an amazing job delivering opening remarks and providing her own thoughts. And so I just want to thank you for that too, Ani. You rock.
Thank you, Ani.
Mm-hmm.
And thank
you
you
so much for coming to speak with us. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I hope that we get to meet in person at some point. And thank you to everybody in the audience. I know that I can't see you, but I'm so grateful that you took time off. Time is so precious. So thank you for being here with all of us tonight. It really means a lot.